In today's episode, we're going to pick up where we left off with Wayne Jett. So this is part 2. Hope you enjoy it, and thank you for listening.
The time of the Great Depression and the things that have done that got Roosevelt started in terms of what he was able to do for the big banks and knocking out their competition, also in terms of hurting the middle class. Now, if we can go ahead to other things that he did, he continued the gold buying all 8 of his first 8 years in office. Every year, as an average during that period of time, he bought something like an average of 265 metric tons of gold each year. He bought, within those 8 years, more than 3 times as much gold as the United States had accumulated in all of its years from the creation of the United States up through 1930. That's including even the 20s, when we were growing at such a fast rate, the entire 20th century and so forth. He bought a total of 13,185.3 metric tons of gold in those first 8 years. And in order to do that, he was taking money out of the U.S. economy in taxes and in mortgage bonds, borrowing, paying interest to borrow the money to buy gold, to put the gold in the treasury. And here is the killer on the thing. He made certain that the U.S. Treasury did not monetize, that the Federal Reserve did not monetize the gold that he bought. It was secreted away in violation of the gold standard, which required that when the nation increases its gold supply, it increases its money supply to enable its economy to buy more things from other countries in order to make sure that the monetization of gold stays in effect no matter which country has it. He made sure that that didn't happen, and I'll tell you, if we have the time, how he did that in a particular year. Well, I'll go ahead and tell you right now while it's in mind. In 1937, early 1937, this was just after he was elected to his second term. Somebody tipped Franklin Roosevelt off that the Treasury had actually had an inflow of gold based on international trade. There was an inflow of gold that I interpret as being from Europe of $7 billion. $7 billion in gold, a lot of gold. So I attributed in 1937 probably to fears of war coming in Europe and Europeans liquidating their factories or liquidating their businesses and transferring the money into the United States, which results in a gold flow because they're changing their European currency into dollars, and that requires a gold flow into the country. Well, as soon as Roosevelt was tipped on that, he notified Morgenthau at Treasury that this was hot gold that could be taken out of the country at any time, and therefore it should not be monetized because it would possibly disrupt the recovery by adding money that could then be taken out later and would hurt us. And so Morgenthau was told by Roosevelt to contact the Federal Reserve and make sure that that gold was not monetized. Well, Morgenthau supposedly indicated in his diary that he didn't think that was a very good idea or that sound reasoning, but nevertheless, he contacted the Fed. The Fed had a new chairman from Utah, Mariner Eccles, appointed by Roosevelt. But Eccles responded to Morgenthau that he thought it was a terrible idea, that there was no reason not to monetize that gold, and it would help the economy greatly. In fact, Eccles wrote back a strong letter to Morgenthau saying so and refusing to demonetize that gold, or at least stating that it was something that should not be done. So as a result, with the loggerheads between the Fed chairman and Treasury and Roosevelt convenes a meeting of the three. And of course, Eccles in the meeting with Roosevelt buckles and agrees that they will demonetize that gold. Well, so they go back and labor over the oars of writing the regulations, providing for that demonetization. And when the regulations were published, Eccles says he was embarrassed to see or say that the regulations not only demonetized that $7 billion worth of gold, it also demonetized all the gold bought, even the gold bought from U.S. domestic mines. So that is as clear an indication as you can find and as you need to be certain that Roosevelt wanted to minimize the supply of money in the country to the greatest extent possible. Even the gold coming in from commercial transfers from Europe was not permitted to be monetized, nor was the gold bought from U.S. domestic mines. So he wanted to have as little money in the country as possible. And of course, the symptoms in the country with him borrowing from the country and also taxing the country so highly, the symptoms, everyone would tell you, if you ask how things are here, they'd say nobody has any money. And that was exactly the condition that Roosevelt produced purposely. It could not have been by accident, in my estimation. It was so carefully designed and so effectively enforced. It was a deliberate effort to cause severe deflation so that people with wealth could buy real assets at 2 to 3 to 5 cents on the dollar. And that's exactly the conditions that made, for example, J. Paul Getty, one of the richest men in the world, supposedly, at least by the reported reputation. I doubt that he was, but he became a giant factor in the oil business because he said, I could hardly believe it. I could buy oil, the best in the world, any place I wanted for 5 cents on the dollar or less. That is the product of deliberately caused deflation. And that's what Roosevelt did. Now, that's not all he did, so let me try to add a few more things. I've mentioned the taxes, but once they got the Federal Reserve Reform Act passed in 1935, it allowed Roosevelt to appoint more members of the Federal Reserve Board, supposedly in order to be able to control the board. Well, the first meeting that FDR controlled board had of the Fed was in August of 1937. August of 36. I'm sorry, August of 36. And the first thing they did was increase the reserve requirements of banks by 50%. Now, there was no banking crisis in the country at that time, and the banks were fully loaned up. Therefore, they had to, in order to increase the reserves, they had to foreclose loans, even if they were in payment status. And so, of course, there were many more businesses shut down. There were many more homes lost, and more small businesses lost, more farms lost, foreclosed upon.
Yep.
All of those people thrown out of their properties, even though they were not in trouble, because of this absolutely outrageous action by the FDR-controlled Federal Reserve Board. After his reelection in the fall of 36, in January of 37, the Fed board did exactly the same thing again by increasing reserve requirements another 33%. So in those two actions of August of 36 and January 37, there was an effective increase in reserve requirements, a doubling reserve requirements for the banks.
Wow.
And therefore cutting in half their lending capacity. And so you can see why so many more people were thrown on the streets, thrown on the roads to California for many in the country, trying to find some place to find work or find a way to support families and feed them. And why were they doing this? Because according to social science studies done years later by social scientists in other countries, the only two I found were one in Germany and one in Russia. The one in Germany concluded that more than 3 million, at least, Americans had died of starvation during the years of the Great Depression. The one in Russia had computed that more than 6 million had died in the Great Depression in America alone. This is not worldwide. This is America alone. And it's important to understand that these numbers have to be put into effect with, for example, such programs as the management of prices for milk and meat and food and so forth. One of the first things Roosevelt ordered in 33 in his so-called efforts to get farm prices up was that 6 million small or baby pigs had to be slaughtered and buried so they wouldn't grow into meat animals to feed people, because that would keep the price of pork down. They poured milk into the ground so that it would get milk prices up and so forth. This is the kind of just out and out evil that was done when clearly the prices on pork and beef and grain and so forth and so on were manipulated so badly in the markets by controlling or hitting prices the worst when the harvests come in and things of that sort. It was a very deliberate thing to do, and another reason why most certainly Franklin Roosevelt was not a traitor to his class. He was a traitor to the electorate that trusted his words when they put him in office. Let me mention to you, for example, one of the things that happened in 1939. Now, by 1939, as I told you earlier, the 38 election, Democrats had lost 83 seats in the House. And so the bloom on the rose of the Franklin Roosevelt presidency was definitely getting loose in the leaf. And the Democrats wanted to have nothing to do with raising taxes again, as Roosevelt proposed. But in March 5th, I believe it was a Wednesday, the first week in March of 1939, Roosevelt had just returned from a naval cruise for relaxation, and Morgenthau wrote in his diary that he was able to get a luncheon appointment with him on Wednesday, and he says that he told Roosevelt that he had prepared a plan for tax cuts. that if adopted, as he proposed, that we could have an economic boom within a week. Within a month. And that he wanted to bring that plan over to the White House with his top advisor and go over it with the president, because he said, boy, if we could get this depression licked, you'd be a hero. You'd be the greatest president ever in history. And I want to help you do that. And so I'd like to come over. So they arranged. Roosevelt reluctantly agreed to it, but they went over 2 days later, and Morgenthau took with him John Haynes, his undersecretary, and the tax plan, and they sat down with Roosevelt to go over it. Now, as Morgenthau had told Roosevelt at lunch on Wednesday, he said, I want to bring over to you, when I come, I want to bring you a little copy of a sign that I've got on my desk. A constituent brought it in, and when people come in to see me, they love it. It says, does it help the recovery? He said, people come in and see that sign, and they know that we're working full time on making sure we have an economic recovery here. So anyway, he's there, and he brings his little sign. He makes his presentation. Roosevelt tells him, you're trying to get me to cut taxes, and if I do that, my enemies are going to think that I've been beaten. They'll think that I'm on the run, and I'll be dragged out of this office by a man on horseback. In other words, I guess a military man with a coup. And Morgenthau, of course, is arguing back, oh, no, Mr. President, people would love you for this. We get this economic depression beat. And Roosevelt says to him, that little sign of yours is very silly. This is not about recovery. This is a matter of politics. And so Morgenthau and Haynes are going out the front door of the office with their tails between their legs, and Roosevelt shouts to them, for God's sake, don't be so innocent. Now, this is in the published diary of Morgenthau that was then actually even translated or published in print with the Morgenthau's help editing it. So I think that's about as close as we're going to get to the truth about what Roosevelt was all about. And yet, despite the careful documentation of all these things and the fact that these are clearly matters of fact, of a recorded fact that are available to scholars, why is it that we haven't had a scholar yet that connected with an academic institution that has reported these things? And there are many tomes on the subject of the Great Depression, and yet mine is the first to go into documenting this kind of history. And I can assure your listeners that there is much more to it than I've been able to relate in our discussion this morning. But that's the kind of thing. It very much gets into the area of the provocation of wars. I told you that I didn't discover until later, after all this research. I learned as I was about to finish the editing, well, not quite finish the editing, but my book was near completion before I learned about the book written by H.G. Wells, published in 1901, that laid out the plan. Laid out the plan for the Federal Reserve, for central banks, for a network of central banks that would control finances and money supply and so forth. An income tax, a graduated income tax on earned income, which was the earned income is the hallmark of the middle class, is to base the tax base of the country on the middle class, not on the upper wealthy. To have a system of tax-exempt charities, so-called, that would basically be foundations or trusts that would shield the wealth of the very wealthy from taxation and let them do what they want. In that regard, I'd like to point out that in recent years, you'll recall the attacks by the IRS against the taxpayers' revolt people. You might help me on the names of those groups.
The Tea Party.
Yeah, the Tea Party. The Tea Party groups were attacked by the IRS and challenged on their tax-exempt status and so forth, and denied tax-exempt status. Well, if they can cheat against the little guys, they can sure cheat for the big guys. There's covered in my book also, back in the 1950s, there was an investigation by Congress into the big tax-exempt organizations, which learned that those organizations have very much been involved with carrying the load of doing the heavy lifting and planning for how the plan written by H.G. Wells to be carried into effect. What's the best and most effective way to control populations? What's the best and most effective way to curb the growth in population?
You're talking about this is the church committee and researchers on there. I can't recall all the names, but Dodd.
Actually, there was a man by the name of Norman Dodd.
Dodd. Yeah, Norman Dodd. Yeah.
Worked for the House committee, the committee was inquiring into the activities of such large foundations as the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace and the Ford Foundation and so forth. And the report that Mr. Dodd made in an interview that he granted shortly before his death in 1982 reported that the Ford Foundation had called him up when he had contacted them to look into their records. They'd called him up and he met with the president of the Ford Foundation, who basically said that they reported to a higher authority than the U.S. government, and that their intentions were to meld the U.S. educational system into the Soviet education system. Going over to the Carnegie Foundation, he was invited to come up and meet with them. And they had a new young president who, perhaps foolishly, from his standpoint, suggested that Dodd sends somebody up there rather than sending their records down or subpoenaing them or things like that. Just send somebody up and we'll let them look at whatever they want to look at. And they can be here for 2 or 3 weeks, and then let's see where we are. Well, he sends a young woman up who actually was very sympathetic to the foundations, a young woman lawyer, and what she found were such things as in the early papers, the early years of the Carnegie Endowment. They had spent from 1900 to 1910 or thereabouts, that first decade of the 20th century, they were studying what conditions are best for molding the thoughts and controlling the public in terms of modifying their thinking. And they had, for example, concluded in that study that it helps a great deal to do that if you have a big war. If there's a big war going on, then you can really take control of the civil population. And another thing that this young woman found when she went there is that now this was in the 1950s that she was going back to look at those records. Dodd had told her basically what to look for and what records to check. She found a letter written from the head of the Carnegie Endowment to President Wilson in 1917, right at the time that the U.S. was getting into the World War I, sending men over to Europe to fight. Even though he had said that he wouldn't do that during his election process, but nevertheless, that letter from Carnegie's Foundation had said, make sure that you don't let the war end too soon. That's bad enough in itself, but when I put the fact of the matter that it was not long after we started that a young man in the U.S. Army at Fort Leavenworth, Kansas, was infected with what became known as the Spanish flu, because his unit, this assistant cook in the Army, was then shipped with his unit to Europe, to Spain, in fact, as their first deployment into World War I. And by the time they got to their Spanish destination, they were well infected with that Spanish flu, which, of course, wound up killing tens of millions of people worldwide and killed more Americans than all of our wars in history put together, by far. It seems that there's very, I think, strong reason to believe that influenza was a laboratory-made means of killing that proved to be very effective, although not as effective, apparently, as the Global Cabal had wished, because its efforts and desires to reduce the population through the 20th century and into the 21st century have still remained very strong. They think they're way behind schedule, since the world population has increased so much over and above what it was when they made the plan to exterminate all that they did not want. I can pause a little bit to allow you to guide me if you like. I appreciate the chance to discuss these things, but they're not easy or pleasant to talk about.
No, they're not, but they're historical. I mean, they're history, real history, and
well, let me move to a point that I think would add on to what I just said, in terms of perhaps coming to a point of winding up today, if you wish to do so. In 1938, Stalin, of course, was in the middle of his purges of what he regarded as the Global Cabal, those connected with the ruling elite and his government had been trying to purge him, and he began purges and arrests. And one of the people that he arrested was his former ambassador to France. And that man was accused of being someone trying to subvert his government. He was given a show trial. He was sentenced to death and then interrogated, as many others were, to find out what he would tell about those he had been working with. Well, we know about this because this particular man was recorded in his discussions in his interrogation by another man who was a qualified physician to administer so-called truth serums, that is, medications of a nature that would enable a person to be sharp in their thinking and also relaxed and willing to speak freely and truthfully in a hope to save their life and not be so nervous about it because they were already under death sentence that they would forget or they would misstate or something of the sort. We know about this because the man who was administering the so-called medications was also responsible for recording the interrogation, both the questions and the answers. And he was to make a manuscript, 2 copies, one for Stalin and one for the head of the secret police. Apparently he made, in this case, he made 3 copies and kept one on his body, which was discovered during World War II when the man died, discovered by a Spanish soldier there in Russia fighting on the side of the Russians. It was taken back to Spain and published there in Spanish as part of a larger book. And then finally it was translated by a Russian immigrant to the United States and published in softback form, a small book called The Red Symphony. The Red Symphony I was given a copy of by a very good man, a publisher at the time of Tragedy and Hope.
Oh, yeah.
The great book, so well known. He passed that along to me, and it was so brilliant that I had to account for it. I think that's why the man took the chance with his own life, that if he were found, he would certainly have been executed himself if he were found to have made that 3rd copy. But the interrogation showed that this elitist prisoner was such a brilliant man that stories or information best we have is that he may very well have been spared execution because he was such a valuable advisor to Stalin. He told him things, for example, in the interrogation that he certainly didn't know, including that Russia would be invaded by Germany, when Stalin at the time almost surely believed that he had made a secret agreement with Germany to make them allies. In any event, I do a half a chapter on that Red Symphony in chapter 17 of my book, and one of the things that it makes clear, among a number of other things, is that Franklin Roosevelt was most certainly the most highly trusted political public operative of the ruling elite they had ever empowered. That he was so cunning and so capable in his communications with the public that he could do things that accomplished their objectives and still have the support of the people and fool them so badly that he was given his head and in fact was made the chief operative so that he could decide how things were to be done in order to accomplish the goals of the global kingmakers elite or cabal. And he said it had to be a special man, and that special man was composed of both Franklin and Eleanor Roosevelt, because they had to be sure that even the female in the, actually they called her a two-sexed person, but that they had to be sure that his spouse would not be someone who would spill the beans or divulge the truth about what FDR was all about. So that is the kind of thing that we have to bring our heads around. I certainly had to do so myself in terms of understanding that what I had been told, that our government had done all it could to protect its people, to make them as well off as possible, to help them, to save them, all of those things that my teachers believed and had been told, and we're still told today, were false, and that we had to deal with this force that had been identified way back in 1880 as a powerful pecuniary force that dominates every nation, writing laws and molding thoughts. Those were the words of a man practically unknown today by the name of Henry George. In fact, he was unknown at the time he wrote his famous book, published. He self-published it with the help of a few friends back in 1879, 1880. He had to go with 5,000 copies. And the book is called Progress and Poverty. It is very eloquently written and reasoned. And I had never heard of it. I had never heard of him until I had learned about it by putting my hand on it in a library, public library, and picking it up and learning then that it was by far the greatest selling book on economics ever written. It's not really exactly about economics, although it's on economic topics, and particularly about public policy. And telling how wrong most basic theories of public policy were, how the public was led down the wrong path at every opportunity, to believe the wrong things, to initiate the wrong political support, and so forth. And he argues very effectively that is done by this powerful pecuniary force that writes laws and molds thoughts in every nation. That's about as much as he could say about it, and he says it just in one paragraph in the last chapter of the book, after he had shown that, for example, the Malthusian theory that overpopulation causes poverty is completely wrong. He takes it apart in very convincing terms, as he does a number of other theories as well, and finally winds up explaining that poverty is worst right around the areas of the greatest wealth, and those are the reason for that is that those of great wealth usually buy up all of the unoccupied land around them, and they hold it off the market. And he points out that the people who have to work for a living, those who are not wealthy, especially those who are poor, need land in order to support their families. They can be productive if they have land to work on, but if they don't, then they're basically left looking for handouts or whatever work the rich will give them at whatever wages the rich will give them, which ordinarily is only subsistence wages because the wealthy want them to stay impoverished and therefore obligated to work for them at those low wages. And he proposes a solution to that I won't go into it. I do devote an entire chapter to that book and to its great influence on the world. It sold more than 2 billion copies between 1880 and 1900, and made that man so popular and wealthy enough to move from California, where he became bankrupt during the Great Depression of the 1870s. His newspaper failed, and he went back to New York, where he had been for a few years, failing then at the time during that Great Depression. And yet he became so influential that he was begged and entreated to run for mayor of New York City. And that's another story too that I detail in my book. But
Wayne, I think that I know that the information that you present in your book is serious. It's heavy, and it's somewhat disappointing, and it's very eye-opening. Disappointing in the fact that this kingmaker cabal, as you described, the secret elite, the rulers, I call them the bankers that go all the way back in history. It's very sobering for the all-American individual to even come to terms with the construct that we're born into and the history of this construct. But I think that you have to be able to properly classify things. You have to be aware of what is going on in the big wide world. You have to be able to properly classify things. So if you know what's going on, you'll know what to do. I believe that as a fundamental philosophy. And then
well, not only that, the time my book came out in 2011, we didn't have the prospect in sight, in view, that we have today. I'm amazed to be able to say, as we sit here today, that as if by miracle, we have, for the first time in my lifetime, an elected president that was not put in office, at least under the pledge of some kind or other to the global cabal, to the kingmakers cabal. And I had come to the view some years back, during the writing of my book or thereafter, that we could not have a president actually capable of freeing us from this cabal if he were put in office by the cabal, as appears to have been the case in each case previously. So I had come to the view that maybe a wealthy person of great dedication might come to the fore, but I didn't have any great hopes that one would. And lo and behold, my ears got points on the top when I first heard that Donald Trump was thinking of running for president. Not necessarily because I had such a high opinion of him, but he at least met the requirement that he'd have to have his own money if he were to be able to prevail in the presidential race without having the support of the so-called establishment. That at least back in 1880, the same time Henry George's book came out, apparently the kingmakers decided that they could no longer just depend upon controlling the presidential candidate of one party. They had to have both of them at all times. They had, for example, in 1880, they got James Garfield, which was a revolt in the Republican convention. And James Garfield, of course, had the potential and the objectives of being a truly great president and reforming our finances, as he said in his inaugural address. and they shot him within 3 months of his inauguration or thereabouts. And the shooting wasn't successful, and so they had to have their physicians poison him by examining his wounds daily with their bare fingers. In any event, this is a tremendous opportunity that we have since 2016. I've jokingly said that I'm still exhilarated from having dodged the bullet in 2016 because things were getting very dark in this country in terms of the prospects and the activities of the government. In past years, but certainly since 2000, it's hard to find a place to stop when you start going back. How bad has it been, or how long? It goes back. It may at least goes back to 1900, and it's a difficult thing to have to come to grips with, especially. Wow, at the time my book came out, not really even a chance to say, "Oh, but we're going to get them now." Because there really wasn't a prospect in 2011 of much of a bright, shining light of prospects for doing that. But lo and behold, I'm fully of the belief presently that we do have that prospect now, and in fact, it's underway with the support of a great number of very capable people. And so I'm optimistic about our prospects at this point. It's certainly not over. It's way too early to celebrate, and there'll be difficult times. But I do think we're on the road toward real progress in recovering the ability of nations to govern for the good of the people rather than for the good of the kingmakers. Of course, I write from time to time, as you know, on my website. It's called classicalcapital.com. It has free articles there that I write on more or less current events. But you'll also see at the top of the homepage the advertisement for my book, The Fruits of Graft, Great Depressions Then and Now. It's $25 in hardback form. That is a hardback that is actually sewn bound. That is, it's not glued. It's made so that it'll last for generations because this information has not been provided in a book before, and maybe it won't be again. There are only something in the neighborhood of a few more than 5,000 copies out in the first years since, I guess, 8 years. And the majority of those have been sold within the last year. So I'm glad to see that there's some greater interest thanks to people such as yourself, James, and I very much appreciate the attention to it. The information is important. It's not available in any other book. I cover not only the Great Depression, but events leading up to it. I cover also the tech crash of 2000. I cover the financial crash of 2008 and explain how each of those were contrived and produced and exploited in each of those cases for great profits on the part of the kingmakers and their operatives. It's not capitalism, by the way, that is doing this.
No.
Mercantilism. The economic and social system the United States of America has today is not capitalism. It is mercantilism, which is the economy run by the kingmakers cabal, with hidden policies and hidden operations and protected criminality on their part. Much of what they do is not criminal, but much of it is, because they exploit us in every way, including in the worst cartels and worse than that, I'm afraid that is coming to light. So I'm very hopeful. $25 if you get it from my website, and U.S. domestic shipping is free if you wish, unless you wish for priority mailing. Those who are in other countries need to pick the correct region of the world according to the various tabs on purchasing. I might say that the book has been honored by being named as a life-changing, transformative book. In fact, number 6 on the top 25 of those types of books, as judged by the person I regard as the foremost reviewer of nonfiction in the United States and perhaps in the world. His name is Robert David Steele. He has a website called Phi Beta Iota that announces his views on that sort of thing. But he wrote the first review of The Fruits of Graft by any public figure, and gave it a 5-star rating at that time. But just this year, a few months back, he was commissioned to give a presentation on the most important books he had read, of more than 2,000 over his career, and actually not read, but reviewed, the ones he had reviewed. And of those 2,000 plus, he ranked The Fruits of Graft number 6.
That's powerful.
Importance. So I've got that noted on my website, and I'm very grateful for it. Still, to this time, no other public figure has seen fit to comment on it. And so anything of that nature that can get the information to more people, I'm very much for it. And I certainly appreciate your efforts, James, in this interview this morning.
Well, I thank you for saying that, Wayne. We'll put that in the notes as well. Robert David Steele, 6 out of 2,000. That's extremely powerful. You know, I think the book should be required reading in high school. I think our high school students in America can completely comprehend and even appreciate that level. It's very well written, very well researched, very well documented, and it really should be required reading, in my opinion. And you, I don't believe, can speak intelligently and informatively on the Great Depression unless you've read this book, The Fruits of Graft. But that's, my opinion, and I understand and appreciate that we're all very busy, and it's very time-consuming to read, and we have to be very selective in what we read with the limited amount of time that we generally have. But this is worth the effort, and in my opinion, it's so well documented that one sit down of a thorough reading is not necessarily the best way to do it. I mean, you could read on this book over a couple of months, read a little bit, let it sink in, and that's what I did anyway. So I liked it, and I shared it with my mentor before he passed away, and he had great comments on it. So I promote it as much as I can, as often as I can, because I believe that it should be read. And I appreciate you, Wayne, and your time this morning that you shared with us. And I look forward to, possibly speaking again. I know that we've maybe been here an hour and a half or so, but we barely scratched the surface on some important history. And, we've all heard history repeats itself, history rhymes. And how far back do you want to go in history to look? And we've gone back to 1880 or 1900. I mean, I personally believe that we can go all the way back to recorded history. And the same thing happens over and over and over. And currently today, in 2019, we're just in another iteration or another version of this construct where it's calculated, it's constructed. We almost live in a paradigm. And That's my personal belief, and I believe also that you have to educate yourself. You have to be aware of what's going on so you can properly classify things, and so then you can take proper action for yourself, your family, your clients, and fundamentally our people. So I could go on, but thank you, Wayne. I appreciate you greatly.
Thank you for having me, James, and look forward to our future conversations. And you are the representative of exactly what the book needs. That is, people have to take up the banner and pass this along, because the major media is not going to do it.
Absolutely not.
I'm very vocal about my view, as many others share, I believe, that we have learned that our major media is a part of the kingmakers cabal. They've acquired the ownership of it. It's commonly said that all of our major media in America is owned by 6 corporations. Well, my research indicates that last I looked, at least, all 6 of those has the same major shareholder, and you can be sure that those corporations are working for a master, and they are not servants of the people. So that's what we're dealing with, and I'm happy to have a role in it. I'm as amazed as anyone else that I would be the one to write this book. But nevertheless, it's what fell to me, and I'm really glad that I did.
Yeah.
And so thank you for your help in calling people's attention to it and passing information along.
You're welcome. Well, good job, Wayne. I appreciate you and look forward to talking with you again in the future. Okay.
All right. Thanks for having me.
You bet. Have a great day. Bye-bye.
Thank you for joining us on the Banking with Life podcast. If you're watching on YouTube, make sure to like and subscribe and click on that little notification bell. Otherwise, join us on Apple Podcasts and Stitcher for weekly content.